Welcome back to Detective Podcast. Tonight's story creeps out of the shadows, but before we step inside, tell us, where in the world are you listening from? Drop your city and country in the comments and become part of our growing circle of curious minds. Now, settle in. The investigation begins. Chapter 1. The village of St. Aldhelm's on the hill was never so beautiful as when it was pretending not to be serious. Each summer, with a solemnity that bordered upon comedy, the parish surrendered itself to the flower festival. The ancient church, older than its own memories, was dressed like a shy old lady persuaded into finery. Pillars that had once echoed with Latin chant now bore cascades of roses. Saints carved in stone peered out from behind garlands of lilies, as though mildly embarrassed by the attention. Even the air inside seemed altered, scented with damp stone, beeswax, and the sharp sweetness of freshly cut flowers. The villagers came and went with that peculiar English air of cheerful duty, as if beauty itself were a moral obligation best discharged briskly. The festival chairman, Mr. Leonard Price, presided over it all with an expression of resolute skepticism, like a man supervising a miracle he had already decided to disbelieve. "It's all very well," he was heard to say, adjusting the placement of a hydrangea near the font, "but flowers don't improve theology, and they certainly don't improve acoustics." This remark was addressed to no one in particular, but it happened to be overheard by Father Brown, who stood nearby examining a modest arrangement of daisies with great interest. The little priest, round and unremarkable as a sparrow, nodded gravely, as though Price had made a profound metaphysical statement. "No," Father Brown said mildly, "but they do remind us that the world was meant to be beautiful even when we misunderstand it." Mr. Price stared at him for a moment, uncertain whether he was being contradicted or agreed with, and then marched away to correct a volunteer who had placed a sunflower where a carnation ought to be. Father Brown was not officially involved in the festival, though he had been invited, like everyone else, by virtue of existing in the village. He belonged to the quieter parish of St. Mary's down the lane, and had wandered up the hill out of simple curiosity and a fondness for old stones. He looked precisely like the sort of man who might get lost in a crowd and not be noticed for some hours afterward. High above the nave, in the shadowed organ loft, sat Mr. Edwin Harcourt. Mr. Harcourt was old, thin, and reverent, in the way that only the very old can be, less a man than a habit of devotion. He had served St. Aldhelm's as organist for nearly 40 years, and the great instrument seemed to breathe with him, as if wood and pipe had learned his pulse. His hands, spotted and delicate, rested upon the keys with a lover's familiarity. The organ itself was a monster of medieval ingenuity, dark with age and rumour. Its pipes climbed toward the roof like frozen flames, and its lower chambers whispered faintly when no one was near. There were those who claimed it had been rebuilt upon something older, something monkish and half-forgotten, and a travelling antiquarian had been heard to mutter the word relic, with an excitement that bordered on indecency. Mr. Harcourt paid no heed to such things. He believed in order, harmony, and the firm conviction that sacred music should never call attention to itself. When he played, the village did not notice the organ. It noticed only that the church seemed larger, calmer, and closer to heaven. Behind him stood his protégé, Julian Markham, young, dark-eyed, and burning with a reverence of a very different sort. Julian admired Mr. Harcourt with the impatience of youth, an admiration that wished to hurry time along. He believed the old man played beautifully, but cautiously, like one afraid to wake God from sleep. "Just a little more freedom," Julian had once said, gesturing toward the keys. "The organ can do more than murmur, sir." "The sea can do more than murmur too," Mr. Harcourt had replied gently. "But it does not always need to storm." Now, as the afternoon light slanted through the clerestory windows, Mr. Harcourt played softly, while villagers arranged flowers below. The notes rose and fell like breath. Father Brown paused beneath the loft, listening with his head slightly tilted, like a child puzzled by a riddle he almost understood. "It sounds," he murmured to himself, "as if the building were remembering something." Night came quietly to St. Aldhelm's. The flowers were admired, the last candles extinguished, and the heavy oak doors were locked with a care bordering on ceremony. Mr. Price personally checked the bolts, rattling them with satisfaction. The church, full of sleeping colour and ancient silence, was left alone with God. At least so everyone believed. It was just after midnight when the sound began. Not the measured hymnody of evening prayer, nor the tentative whisper of someone practicing scales, but a sudden, terrible music that tore through the darkness like a judgment. The organ burst into life with a wild improvisation upon the dies irae, ancient and inexorable. The notes thundered and twisted, no longer content with reverence, but crying out like a soul that had seen too much. The sound carried across the village, through shuttered windows and into startled dreams. Dogs howled. One or two villagers crossed themselves in bed. Mrs. Agatha Fenwick, the pious widow who lived opposite the churchyard, would later swear that she saw a pale, luminous figure pass before the stained glass window, tall, solemn, and not of this world. The music stopped as abruptly as it had begun. By morning, St. Aldhelm's was unlocked to discover a silence heavier than any sound. In the organ loft, seated upright at the console, was Mr. Edwin Harcourt. He was quite dead. A small vial lay hidden among the sheet music, and the physician would later confirm poison. Stranger still, the organ bench stood in a perfect circle of undisturbed dust, as though no living foot had approached it. The narrow door to the loft was bolted firmly from the inside. Outside, the flowers nodded in the sunlight, innocent and absurdly alive. And Father Brown, standing once more beneath the organ pipes, looked up slowly with an expression not of surprise but of sorrowful understanding. Chapter 2. If the midnight music had shattered the peace of St. Aldhelm's, the morning that followed shattered its confidence. The church, which only yesterday had been a place of decoration and mild piety, now resembled a courtroom hastily converted from a theatre. Men spoke in lowered voices, women whispered behind gloved hands, and the flower arrangements seemed suddenly theatrical, like props left over from a forgotten play. The organ loft, sealed off by a rope and a sign of official authority, drew the eye with the fascination of a wound. Dr. Herbert Lowe, a thin man whose professional calm masked a chronic discomfort with the mysteries of the human soul, stood near the chancel steps wiping his spectacles. "Poison," he repeated to anyone who would listen, "administered orally, swift but not instantaneous." He would have had time to react. "To play," corrected Mr. Price, sharply. "Which is the point everyone seems eager to overlook." The festival chairman's face was pale with irritation rather than grief. He had the air of a man whose rational universe had been personally insulted. "I do not believe in curses, ghosts, or angels playing the organ at midnight. Therefore there must be a perfectly sensible explanation." "Sense," said Father Brown, gently, who had been kneeling to examine the worn stone near the pews, "is often what frightens people most." Mr. Price turned, startled. He had forgotten the little priest was there, which was precisely the effect Father Brown seemed to have on people. "With respect, Father," he said, "this is not a theological matter." "No," said Father Brown, rising and brushing dust from his cassock. "It is a human one. Those are usually worse." The constable, a young man still uncertain whether authority resided in his uniform or in his notebook, approached them. "Sir," he said to Mr. Price, "we'll need a list of anyone with access to the organ loft." "That's simple," Price replied. "Mr. Harcourt himself and his assistant, Markham. No one else has had reason to be up there in years." At the mention of his name, Julian Markham looked up sharply from a pew where he sat with his hands clasped too tightly together. His face was drawn, not with grief, but with something more restless. "I didn't kill him," he said abruptly before anyone had accused him. Dr. Lowe coughed. "No one has suggested—" "But they will," Julian interrupted, "because it's neat, because I wanted his position, because I play the organ." Father Brown studied the young man with a curious softness, like a doctor observing a familiar illness. "You loved him," he said. Julian flinched. "I admired him," he corrected. "Which is not the same thing." "Sometimes," Father Brown replied, "it is more dangerous." Mrs. Fenwick chose that moment to sweep forward, her black shawl floating behind her like a banner of righteous sorrow. She was a woman who believed deeply, loudly, and with a confidence that left little room for doubt or contradiction. "I warned him," she declared. "I warned them all." Mr. Price sighed. "Mrs. Fenwick, please." The music was changing, she insisted, her eyes bright. It was growing proud, not like hymns, but like proclamations. "Last night was a judgment. I saw the messenger." Dr. Lowe looked uncomfortable. "Madam, grief can—" "I saw him," she repeated. "Tall, pale, shining. He stood in the window as the music rose. No mortal man could have played like that." Father Brown inclined his head politely. "Angels," he said, "are often blamed for what men do in the dark." She stared at him, uncertain whether he was agreeing with her or rebuking her. The travelling antiquarian arrived late, as men often do when they believe history will wait for them. Erasmus Bell was a stooped figure with bright eyes and fingers stained by ink and dust. He made straight for the organ loft, only to be stopped by the rope. "A tragedy," he murmured, gazing upward with an enthusiasm that was not entirely appropriate. "A terrible tragedy, but also fascinating." Mr. Price bristled. "This is not an exhibition, Mr. Bell." "No, of course not," Bell said, waving a hand. "But you see, that organ is no ordinary instrument. Parts of it predate the Reformation. There are legends, quite scholarly ones, about a reliquary built into its frame, a bone perhaps, a finger, something associated with a medieval saint known for auditory visions." "Saints," Price snapped, "do not murder organists." Father Brown smiled faintly. "No," he said, "but stories do." The day wore on in questions and half-answers. The locked loft baffled everyone. The dust disturbed no one. The vial appeared from nowhere and everywhere. The poison, Dr. Lowe admitted reluctantly, could have been mixed into communion wine or into tea. By late afternoon, suspicion had settled most heavily upon Julian Markham, not because the evidence pointed to him, but because ambition is easier to accuse than silence. He bore it badly, pacing the churchyard like a man rehearsing his own defence. Father Brown watched him from a bench beneath a yew tree. "You hear music when you are angry?" the priest asked suddenly. Julian stopped. "What?" "Some men hear insults, some hear commands, some hear applause. You strike me as someone who hears music." Julian laughed bitterly. "If I heard applause, I wouldn't be standing here." "No," Father Brown agreed. "You'd be playing." The young man's face darkened. "He was holding the organ hostage," he burst out, as if humility were the same as fear. "The instrument can speak, it can warn, it can—" "Judge," Father Brown suggested softly. Julian said nothing. As evening approached, the church was closed once more, this time not for reverence, but for caution. The flower festival was postponed. The bells were silent. St. Aldhelm's seemed to shrink back into itself, like an old witness refusing to testify. Father Brown remained behind as others drifted away. He stood alone in the nave, looking up at the organ pipes disappearing into shadow. "The trouble with playing God," he said aloud to the empty church, "is that God hears the mistakes." High above, in the dark, something clicked softly, like wood settling, or a memory adjusting its place. Father Brown did not startle. He merely waited. Chapter 3. The following morning arrived with an air of careful politeness, as though the village itself wished to apologize for having been frightened. Sunlight crept over the churchyard stones, pausing respectfully at the doors of St. Aldhelm's, which remained closed not from sanctity, but from suspicion. Father Brown was among the first to arrive. He carried no notebook and asked no questions, which made him, in the eyes of the constable, the least useful man present. He stood instead by the side entrance, gazing at the weathered carvings of saints whose names had been forgotten, but whose expressions suggested they knew more than they told. Inside, the constable and Dr. Lowe were already examining the organ loft with renewed seriousness. A ladder had been fetched, and the narrow stair that wound upward was measured, tapped, and sniffed at like a trail by inexperienced hunters. "The dust," the constable said for the third time, "hasn't been disturbed." Father Brown climbed the ladder slowly, breathing a little harder than the others, but with the patience of one accustomed to narrow passages. He did not look at the bench at first. He looked at the walls. "Dust," he said thoughtfully, "is very honest. It records everything except motives." Dr. Lowe frowned. "Unless someone floated." "Or was already there," Father Brown replied. The remark hung in the air, lightly but insistently. The organ loft was a cramped space, darker than expected, filled with the faint, medicinal smell of polish and old wood. Sunlight reached it only in thin stripes, illuminating the keys, the pipes, and the place where Mr. Harcourt had sat for the last time. Father Brown knelt, not to pray, though he often did that too, but to look beneath the bench. There, partially hidden behind a support beam, lay a thin scrap of paper, folded and creased by nervous handling. He did not pick it up. Instead, he asked, "Has anyone else been allowed up here?" The constable hesitated. "Only Mr. Bell yesterday evening. He insisted on inspecting the organ for historical reasons." "Ah," said Father Brown, "history has a way of insisting." They descended, and Father Brown sought out Mr. Bell, who was waiting impatiently near the font, tapping his cane against the stone with scholarly irritation. "You were up in the loft yesterday," Father Brown said. Yes, Bell replied. "Briefly, I was looking for markings, monastic symbols, evidence of early alterations. I found nothing of value." "Nothing at all?" "Well," Bell admitted, "there was an old compartment, sealed, too sealed. I didn't force it, of course, one must respect." "Locks?" Father Brown asked mildly. "Symbols," Bell corrected. "Spiritual warnings." Father Brown smiled, as though at a child describing dragons. Later that afternoon, he called upon Mrs. Fenwick. Her sitting room was dim and carefully arranged to encourage reverence. Religious prints lined the walls in a kind of visual chorus, all gazing inwards, saints, martyrs, angels frozen in moments of sublime suffering. She received him with satisfaction, as if he had finally come to confirm what she already knew. "You have questions," she said. "I have curiosities," Father Brown replied. "You said you saw a figure." "Yes." "Did it move?" "No." "Did it speak?" "No." "Did it play?" Mrs. Fenwick hesitated. The music was already there. Father Brown nodded. Then you saw a shape that explained the fear, not the cause. She stiffened. Are you saying it wasn't an angel? I am saying, Father Brown replied gently, that angels are rarely convenient. Her certainty faltered, but she said nothing more. In the early evening, Father Brown visited Julian Markham's lodgings, a small room above the baker's shop, filled with sheet music and unfulfilled intentions. Julian looked surprised, but not offended. You think it was me? Julian said flatly. I think, Father Brown replied, that you wanted it to be no one. Julian laughed sharply. He was poisoning music, he said, reducing it to obedience. Art must risk something. Life risks everything, Father Brown said quietly. Art borrows. Julian turned away, his shoulders tense. Father Brown noticed the piano. May I? He asked. Julian shrugged. The priest played a single chord, simple, unresolved, and let it fade. Did you recognize the Dies Irae immediately? Father Brown asked. Yes. So did the whole village? Yes. And yet, Father Brown continued, it was not written exactly as it should be. Julian frowned. What do you mean? It lingered where it should have moved, Father Brown said. It hesitated. Julian went pale. Harcourt used to do that, he said. He said judgment was never as swift as people imagine. Father Brown stood. Then perhaps, he said, the music was more personal than theatrical. As night fell, Father Brown returned once more to the church, alone. He lit a single candle and climbed the ladder again, his movements careful but unafraid. This time he retrieved the folded paper. It was a fragment of an old score, annotated in 2 hands, one steady, one sharp. At the bottom was a sentence, written and crossed out. Pride does not wait to be forgiven. Father Brown replaced the paper exactly where he found it. He stood in the loft for a long time, listening to the silence. You didn't float, he said softly. You waited. Somewhere deep within the organ, a pipe exhaled faintly, as though acknowledging the truth. Father Brown extinguished the candle and descended. Below, the dust remained untouched, but the lie had already moved. Chapter 4. It was a peculiar feature of St. Aldhelm's that the past did not remain politely behind glass. It leaned forward. It listened. It interfered. Father Brown spent the morning in the vestry with a pile of parish records that smelled faintly of damp leather and candle smoke. The books had been compiled by men who believed that careful handwriting could impose order upon eternity. Baptisms, burials, repairs, donations, all noted with calm assurance, as if nothing truly unexpected had ever happened in the village. Yet the margins told another story. Father Brown's finger traced a faint annotation beside an entry dated more than 3 centuries earlier. It concerned a renovation of the organ, altered to conceal former superstitious appendage at direction of the rector. The phrase was underlined twice, aggressively. A very Anglican way of saying we hid it and hoped God wouldn't notice, Father Brown murmured. He closed the book and went in search of Mr. Bell. The antiquarian was lodging at the inn, surrounded by crates and papers that made his room resemble a scholarly shipwreck. He greeted Father Brown with professional warmth and personal caution. You found something, Bell said. Yes, Father Brown replied. And so have you. You simply haven't decided what it means. Bell smiled thinly. If you're suggesting that a relic committed murder— I am suggesting, Father Brown interrupted gently, that you believe objects explain men. Bell bristled. History matters. So does fear, said Father Brown. Tell me about the compartment. Bell hesitated. It is old, older than the present casing. It could contain anything or nothing. These legends grow in the telling. Did Mr. Harcourt know about it? Bell's eyes flickered. He suspected. He disliked the idea intensely. Because he feared superstition? No, Bell said slowly, because he feared temptation. That afternoon, Father Brown found himself unexpectedly summoned by Mr. Price, who had decided, somewhat belatedly, that the priest's habit of knowing things without asking made him dangerous. "This has gone far enough," Price declared. "The village is whispering nonsense, angels, relics, curses. We need a clear statement." "Truth is rarely clear at first," Father Brown replied. "It must be listened to." Price scowled. "You're implying something?" "Yes," Father Brown said. "That certainty can be more reckless than doubt." Price dismissed him shortly afterward, unconvinced but uneasy. Near dusk, Father Brown encountered Dr. Lowe emerging from the apothecary with a small packet under his arm. "Poison?" Father Brown asked. "Antimony," Lowe replied reluctantly. "Historically popular, slow enough to allow action, tasteless in small doses. In wine." "In tea or communion," Lowe said grimly, "though I prefer not to imagine that." "So do I," Father Brown agreed, "but imagination is sometimes forced upon us." That evening, the church was reopened briefly to allow Mr. Harcourt's belongings to be removed. Julian Markham was present, stiff and silent, as Mrs. Fenwick hovered nearby like a guardian of moral outrage. As Julian climbed the ladder to the loft, Father Brown watched closely. "You hesitate," the priest observed. Julian's hands tightened on the rung. "It feels occupied." "By what?" "Expectation," Julian said bitterly. He always said the organ listened back. At the console, Julian paused. "Something's wrong," he said. "What?" "The bench," Julian replied. "It's been adjusted." Father Brown climbed up beside him. The dust remained pristine, but the bench was closer to the keys than before. "Mr. Harcourt had long arms," Julian continued. "He preferred distance." Father Brown nodded. "Someone shorter." Julian turned sharply. "Bell." "Or someone seated earlier," Father Brown said, "before the dust had time to settle." Julian stared. "You think Harcourt didn't arrive first?" "No," Father Brown said. "I think he arrived last." They descended in silence. Night fell again upon St. Aldhelm's, and with it came a restless wind that threaded through the graveyard stones like whispered accusation. Father Brown remained in the church long after the others had gone. He climbed to the loft alone and examined the rear panel of the organ casing. With careful pressure, he found a seam, not obvious, but honest. The panel opened just enough to reveal a narrow cavity. Inside lay a small wooden box, blackened with age and sealed with wax. Father Brown did not open it. Instead, he noticed the faint residue on the edge of the panel, a crystalline dust, almost invisible. Antimony. The realization did not excite him, it saddened him. Footsteps sounded below. Mr. Bell's voice drifted upward. "I thought I might find you here." Father Brown emerged slowly. "History," he said, "is a jealous god. It punishes those who use it as an excuse." Bell's composure cracked. "You don't understand what that relic represents." "I understand," Father Brown replied, "that you wanted it to sing." Bell laughed harshly. "The organ could have made it known. A miracle. Proof." "Proof," Father Brown said softly, "always demands a sacrifice." Bell said nothing. They stood together in the shadowed loft, the silent keys between them like teeth. "You didn't poison him to kill him," Father Brown continued. "You poisoned him to frighten him. You expected him to stop playing, but pride does not retreat, it performs." Bell's face drained of colour. "He drank the tea," Bell whispered. "I thought he would feel ill. Leave. I never meant—" "Meaning," Father Brown said gently, "is what turns actions into sins." Below them, the church breathed its ancient breath. "The Dies Irae," Father Brown went on, "was not a curse, it was a confession." Bell sank onto the bench, leaving the dust untouched. Outside, the wind fell silent, as though the village itself were listening, waiting for the truth to finish speaking. Chapter 5. Morning arrived with an unnatural clarity, the kind that follows a storm that never quite broke. The bells of St. Aldhelm's remained silent, yet the village woke as though summoned by an unspoken command. Word had spread, not the truth, but the expectation of it. Father Brown did not hurry. He walked slowly through the churchyard, past stones smoothed by centuries of grief, his hands folded behind his back. He looked less like a detective than a man escorting a thought to its proper place. Inside the church, Erasmus Bell sat alone in a pew, his cane laid carefully beside him like an unused weapon. He had not slept. His eyes were sharp with exhaustion, his posture stiff with the discipline of a man who had always trusted reason to save him. "You've come to denounce me," Bell said, without turning. "I've come to prevent you from lying," Father Brown replied. Bell laughed quietly. "I'm an academic. Lying would require imagination." Father Brown took the seat beside him. "You imagined a miracle," he said. "That's worse." Bell's fingers trembled. "The relic, if it truly exists, could change everything we know about medieval worship. Sound as sacrament, music as evidence." "Evidence of what?" Father Brown asked. "That God intervenes." Father Brown shook his head. "God does not intervene to satisfy curiosity. He intervenes to save souls." Bell closed his eyes. "I never wanted Harcourt dead." "No," Father Brown agreed. "You wanted him obedient?" Bell stiffened. "He was afraid of the relic, afraid of its power." "He was afraid of you," Father Brown corrected gently. "Of your certainty." Bell's composure faltered. "I gave him tea," he whispered. "Only enough to make him ill. I thought he would stop playing, that he would leave the organ for the night. And instead," Father Brown said softly, "he chose to speak." Bell nodded, his voice breaking. He knew someone had tampered with the organ, with the box. He believed music could warn us, that if judgment was coming, it should be heard. "And so he played," Father Brown said, "not to terrify the village, but to accuse himself." Bell stared. "Himself?" "Yes," Father Brown replied, "for staying silent too long, for letting pride masquerade as patience." The church door creaked open. Mr. Price entered with the constable, his expression set in the rigid lines of official necessity. Behind them came Dr. Lowe, pale and resolute. "It's time," Price said. "We've delayed enough." Father Brown stood. "Then allow the truth to walk in unaided." Bell rose slowly. "I will tell them," he said. "Everything." Price frowned. "You're confessing." "I am explaining," Bell replied. "Which is more dangerous?" They gathered near the chancel, the organ looming above like a silent witness. Julian Markham stood apart, his face unreadable. Bell spoke plainly. Of the relic, the compartment, the poison meant as a warning. He did not excuse himself, nor dramatize his intentions. He spoke like a man dismantling his own theories. When he finished, the silence was complete. Julian broke it. "You used him," he said hoarsely. "You turned faith into a mechanism." Bell did not deny it. Dr. Lowe cleared his throat. "The law will have its say." "Yes," Father Brown agreed. "But first, let us understand what truly happened." He turned to Julian. "You heard the music?" he said. "What did it say to you?" Julian hesitated. that I wanted the organ more than I wanted the man. Father Brown nodded. And to Mrs. Fenwick, it said angels were angry. To Mr. Price, it said reason had failed. To Mr. Bell, it said proof had arrived. He looked up at the organ. But to Mr. Harcourt, it said only one thing. What? Price demanded. That it was time, Father Brown replied. The constable shifted uncomfortably. Time for what? To stop waiting, Father Brown said. He believed judgment was coming not from heaven but from conscience. Father Brown climbed the steps to the chancel and spoke quietly, but his words carried. Mr. Harcourt took the poison knowing what it was. Not to die, but to suffer. To draw attention, he believed the music would reveal the danger before it revealed the crime. Julian gasped. You mean... He did not intend to die, Father Brown said, but he knew he might. Bell collapsed into the pew. I killed him. Yes, Father Brown said gently, but he chose how to be heard. The weight of it settled upon them all. Not a miracle, not a curse, a collaboration of sins and courage. Later, as Bell was led away, Julian approached Father Brown. He forgave me, Julian said, before he played. He said the organ would outlast us both. Father Brown smiled sadly. Forgiveness is the only sound that carries beyond death. That evening, Father Brown returned to the organ loft alone. He opened the small wooden box at last. Inside lay a fragment of bone, wrapped in cloth, unremarkable and quiet. So much noise, Father Brown murmured, for something so small. He closed the box and resealed it. Below, the village gathered, uncertain but calmer. The flowers had begun to wilt. Father Brown descended the ladder slowly, leaving the relic in silence. Some things, he believed, were not meant to be proved, only understood. Chapter 6. In the days that followed the confession, St. Aldhelm's learned an unfamiliar discipline: restraint. There were no crowds, no reporters, no eager moralists arriving from neighbouring towns. The constable performed his duties efficiently and without spectacle. Erasmus Bell was removed with dignity, his scholarship suddenly irrelevant beside the simplicity of his crime. The law moved forward, steady and unromantic. What remained was harder to manage. The church stayed open, but few entered. The organ loft was avoided as though it retained some residual charge, like a place struck by lightning. Even the flower festival decorations were taken down carefully, their colours dulled, their removal conducted with the discretion of an apology. Father Brown stayed. He spent his mornings in the churchyard, his afternoons in quiet conversation, his evenings in prayer so unobtrusive that most villagers did not notice he was there at all. When people did speak to him, it was rarely about the murder. It was about sleep, guilt, music, or the sudden sense that something solid had shifted beneath their feet. Julian Markham came most often. He sat at the back of the church with the air of a man waiting for instructions that no longer existed. His hands, once restless, were now still, folded as though he feared what they might do if allowed freedom. I don't know whether I should play again, he said one afternoon. Father Brown, polishing a small brass candlestick with unnecessary care, did not answer immediately. Music, he said at last, is like speech. It can be used to persuade, to confess, or to hide. Silence is not always humility. Julian frowned. And ambition? Ambition, Father Brown replied, is only dangerous when it refuses to kneel. Julian absorbed this slowly. Meanwhile, Mr. Price found himself wrestling with a more private discomfort. His skepticism, once worn like armour, had failed him, not because it was false, but because it had been insufficient. He sought Father Brown out one evening with the stiffness of a man unused to uncertainty. I dislike superstition, Price said bluntly, but I dislike being wrong more. Father Brown smiled. Then you are well equipped for wisdom." Price snorted. "You Catholics have an answer for everything." "No," Father Brown said. "We have forgiveness. It answers only one thing, but it answers it completely." Mrs. Fenwick, by contrast, withdrew. Her certainty had collapsed inward, leaving behind something quieter and more fragile. Father Brown visited her once, bringing no arguments and no corrections. "I wanted it to be holy," she said softly. "Something terrible and beautiful." "It was terrible," Father Brown replied, "and it was human. That is usually how holiness begins." She wept then, not loudly but with relief. The organ remained untouched. Dr. Lowe declared it structurally sound, mechanically obedient, and psychologically intimidating. None of these qualities encouraged its use. Even the pigeons that sometimes strayed into the loft seemed to avoid it now. One evening, Father Brown climbed the ladder alone. The loft smelled different without Mr. Harcourt, less of polish, more of dust and waiting. The keys lay silent, pale as teeth that had forgotten their purpose. Father Brown sat on the bench, careful not to disturb anything, and rested his hands upon the wood rather than the keys. "You were braver than you knew," he murmured. He did not believe the dead heard him, but he believed the living did. A memory came to him then, not his own, but one he had heard described by Mr. Harcourt long ago, the sensation that the organ did not produce sound so much as release it. That music was already there, hidden in wood and air, waiting to be permitted. Father Brown pressed a single key. The note was tentative, imperfect, but honest. It did not echo like judgment. It settled like a question. The following Sunday the church was fuller than expected, not crowded, just present. Father Brown did not preside. The rector, pale but composed, conducted the service with care. There was no organ accompaniment, only voices. The hymns were uncertain at first, then stronger, imperfect, but sincere. Julian sat near the front. At the final hymn, he stood. There was a pause, a collective intake of breath. He moved toward the organ loft. Father Brown did not stop him. Julian climbed slowly, deliberately, as though ascending not stairs but a decision. He adjusted the bench, not forward, not back, but somewhere in between. He placed the music on the stand, not Harcourt's annotations, not his own compositions, but a simple hymn. When he played, the sound was restrained. Not timid, restrained. The notes did not announce themselves. They supported, they carried the voices without overtaking them. There was no flourish, no improvisation, no hint of challenge. Father Brown listened from below, his eyes closed. This, he thought, is penance. Afterward, the village lingered. No one applauded. That would have felt wrong. Instead, there was a quiet gratitude that needed no expression. Later, Julian found Father Brown outside, near the lich gate. "I was afraid," Julian admitted. "Good," Father Brown said. "Fear teaches proportion." Julian hesitated. "Do you think he would have approved?" Father Brown considered. He believed music should tell the truth, he said. Today it did. As evening settled, Father Brown prepared to leave St. Aldhelm's. His work, as usual, had concluded without ceremony. He packed little, a book, his breviary, a folded note of thanks from the rector. Before departing, he returned once more to the organ loft. The small wooden box remained hidden, untouched. Father Brown did not open it again. Instead, he whispered, "You were never the point." Then he closed the panel carefully and descended. Behind him, the organ stood silent, not ominously, but patiently, like a conscience at rest. Chapter 7. Time, having caused enough trouble, began quietly to repair it. A week passed, then another. The church doors remained open more often now, not because duty required it, but because the village seemed reluctant to leave the place alone again. St. Aldhelm's had become, improbably, a refuge from speculation. Within its walls, people spoke more softly, as though the building itself were listening and forgiving. Father Brown stayed longer than he had planned. There was no investigation left to conduct, no confession to coax into daylight. Yet something unfinished lingered in the air, something not of law or logic, but of meaning. Father Brown, who had always trusted unfinished things more than completed ones, waited. He noticed changes. Mr. Price attended services now with a thoughtful expression that suggested he was listening less to the sermon and more to himself. Mrs. Fenwick no longer sat rigidly upright. She bowed her head as though prayer had ceased to be performance. Julian Markham practiced daily, but never alone. He insisted the doors remain open, the sound free to wander. One afternoon, Julian approached Father Brown with an unusual request. "Will you come up to the loft with me?" he asked. Father Brown looked up from the pew where he had been reading. "You don't need permission," he said. "I don't want permission," Julian replied. "I want witness." They climbed together. The loft no longer felt oppressive. Sunlight found its way there now, revealing small scratches and worn places that spoke of long use rather than lingering death. Julian sat at the bench but did not touch the keys. "There are things it remembers," Julian said quietly. "The organ, habits, patterns, it wants to return to them." Father Brown nodded. "So do people." Julian swallowed. "Sometimes when I play, I feel him correcting me." Father Brown smiled. "Correction is a form of care." Julian reached into the organ casing and withdrew a narrow strip of parchment. "I found this yesterday," he said. "It wasn't hidden, just overlooked." Father Brown examined it. The writing was faded but legible, a fragment of a sermon, not musical notation. "Music is not the voice of heaven," it read. "It is the echo of obedience." Julian watched him closely. "That's Harcourt's hand." "Yes," Father Brown said, "and his theology." Julian exhaled. "I didn't understand him." "No," Father Brown agreed. "But you listened. That is rarer." That evening, the rector announced a memorial service, not elaborate, not publicized, just a moment of acknowledgement. Mr. Harcourt had been buried quietly, but the village had not yet spoken its goodbye. The church filled slowly. Father Brown sat near the back. Julian waited until the final prayer before playing. He chose no dramatic piece, no ancient chant. He played a simple arrangement of a psalm, steady and restrained, allowing silence between phrases. It was not beautiful in the usual sense. It was honest. As the final note faded, Father Brown noticed something subtle. The villagers did not move at once. They sat breathing together, as though the music had reminded them how. Afterward, outside the church, Dr. Lowe approached Father Brown. "I was wrong," he said abruptly. Father Brown raised an eyebrow. "About which thing?" "About motive," Lowe replied. "I thought it was ambition, or superstition, or fear, but it was fidelity." "Yes," Father Brown said, "fidelity can be dangerous. It asks us to stand still when running would be easier." Later still, Father Brown returned alone to the church. He did not climb to the loft this time. Instead, he stood beneath it, gazing upward. "You see," he said softly, as though continuing a long conversation, "objects remember what we do with them, not as ghosts, but as habits." He thought of the relic, sealed and silent, of Bell's certainty, of Harcourt's patience, of Julian's restraint. "None of you were wrong," Father Brown continued. "You were merely incomplete." A faint creak sounded above. Not the organ, but the wood, settling, adjusting itself to the night. Father Brown smiled. The next morning he prepared to leave St. Aldhelm's. The rector thanked him with awkward gratitude. Mr. Price offered a handshake that lasted longer than necessary. Mrs. Fenwick pressed a small packet of biscuits into his hand, saying nothing. Julian walked with him as far as the hill's edge. "I'm afraid," Julian admitted, "that one day I'll forget what this felt like." "You will," Father Brown said cheerfully. "That's why we build habits." Julian nodded. "Will you come back?" Father Brown considered. "If the organ starts asking philosophical questions again, perhaps." They parted with a smile. As Father Brown descended the path, he heard the organ begin to play, not loudly, not dramatically, a rehearsal, a working sound, the kind that belongs to the living. He did not turn back. St. Aldhelm's stood against the sky, ancient and patient, its windows catching the light without trying to explain it. The organ had spoken of judgment. Now it spoke of order. And Father Brown, walking away with unhurried steps, knew that the last truth of the mystery had finally been told, not in sound, but in silence. Chapter 8. The first frost came quietly, coating the roofs of the village with a pale, brittle sheen. St. Aldhelm seemed to exhale, as though even stone and timber felt the weight of events lift from them. Father Brown returned, not as intruder, investigator, or judge, but simply as witness, curious about the life that remains after fear has passed. Inside the church, the sunlight fell across the pews, slanting through the coloured glass and painting the floor in muted reds, blues and golds. Julian Markham was already there, seated at the organ bench, fingers resting lightly on the keys, waiting. "Have you come to judge?" Julian asked, his tone half jesting, half serious. Father Brown shook his head. "I came to understand what remains." Julian hesitated. "It still feels haunted." "It feels attentive," Father Brown corrected. "Haunted is when the living refuse to listen." The two men were silent for a moment, the organ looming above them like a great patient listener. Father Brown glanced at the small wooden box, still hidden in its compartment. He did not touch it. Its secret had already performed its duty, and now it rested. "You must play again," Father Brown said softly. "Not for the dead, not to prove anything, just to return what belongs to the church." Julian's hands hovered above the keys. "I'm afraid I'll fail." "Then you will succeed," Father Brown replied. "Fear is the music of truth when played well. Courage is merely its accompaniment." Julian exhaled and pressed a note. It sounded plain, uncertain, but the hall absorbed it willingly. A second note followed, then a third. The sound grew cautious and unassuming, not brilliant, not dramatic, not meant to astonish, just honest. Father Brown descended to the nave, taking his usual place near the rear. He noticed how the light shifted across the floor, how the shadows of the pews seemed to sway in rhythm with the music. The villagers began to arrive, slowly, one by one, drawn by the sound more than by obligation. They came not to witness a performance, but to witness reconciliation. Mrs. Fenwick entered quietly, her hands folded, lips pressed together, as if the simple act of walking into the church required courage. She knelt and did not look toward the organ. Father Brown gave her a gentle nod. She understood, somehow, that the music was not about spectacle, it was about humility. Mr. Price and Dr. Lowe arrived together, both stiff and self-conscious. Even the constable, who had once doubted the spiritual value of silence, stepped in and paused, his eyes following the rising notes with an odd, careful reverence. The organ continued, steady and forgiving. The music was imperfect, but it held no accusation. Every note seemed to acknowledge the fear, the ambition, the grief, and the guilt that had gathered in the church like a storm cloud, and then release it. Father Brown observed Julian's face closely. He was not thinking of applause or judgment. He was thinking of Mr. Harcourt, of the choices the old organist had made, of the humility required to confront one's own pride. The boy's fingers trembled occasionally, but he continued, steadier with each measure. At last, the music slowed, giving space for silence to return. The villagers remained seated, unwilling to disturb the fragile peace. Father Brown noticed that even the air seemed lighter, as though it too had learned patience. He stepped forward and addressed them softly. "You have all seen what can happen when ambition outweighs wisdom, when fear is unexamined, when judgment is hurried. The truth does not always arrive in a single note. Sometimes it arrives slowly, insistently, and waits for the living to acknowledge it." He paused. Mr. Harcourt believed that music could teach humility. He was right. It can do so without words, without judgment, without anger, and it does so still in the hands of those who are willing to listen. Julian lowered his hands. "Will it forgive us?" he asked quietly. Father Brown smiled. "It does not forgive. It teaches. Forgiveness is our part to offer, not the organ's." One by one, the villagers rose and left the church. No one spoke above a whisper. No one rushed to explain, excuse, or debate. They had witnessed something unspoken but deeply understood. Even the frost outside seemed less like punishment now and more like a reminder that life, like music, moves forward. Father Brown lingered. He ascended the loft once more, not to play, but to observe. He pressed a single key, middle C. It resonated quietly, pure and clear. He let it fade. "The relic?" Julian asked from below. Father Brown shook his head. "Its purpose is complete. The truth it revealed is sufficient. It need not be known to anyone else." Julian studied him and Bell. "He will face justice," Father Brown said, "but the judgment of men is far less permanent than the judgment of conscience. Remember that, Julian. It is the longer music." Night fell. Father Brown walked slowly from the churchyard, pausing at the lich gate to look back. The organ loft was dark now, silent as a stone. The village lay quiet beneath the frost, and somewhere a crow called, but even its sound seemed tempered by peace. He reflected, as he often did, on the curious duality of human nature. How ambition and fear, pride and humility, cruelty and compassion can all coexist in the same heart. The mystery of the organ had not been merely mechanical or legal. It had been moral, spiritual, and profoundly human. The keys themselves had merely waited for the right hands to acknowledge that. Father Brown tucked his breviary under his arm and walked down the path, past the village houses, past the hedgerows, frost-bitten with delicate ice. He did not hurry. He had no cases awaiting him, no urgent questions pressing. What he carried now was the quiet knowledge that the story, like the music, had run its course. He paused briefly by the edge of the river, watching the thin sheet of ice catch the moonlight. Even the smallest reflections held significance, he thought. Light and dark mingled easily, and yet each retained its identity. So it is with human hearts, he reflected. And so, in truth, it is with music. Turning finally, Father Brown set off down the lane, his steps measured, almost meditative. The village behind him was still, the church resting in its ancient patience, the organ silent but listening. Somewhere, in the loft or perhaps in memory, the notes of the last hymn lingered, a quiet testament to truth, humility, and the healing of conscience. He did not look back again, and in that silence St. Aldhelm's waited, not for miracles, not for fear, not for accusation, but for those willing to remember that life, like music, is never entirely silent, and that the most lasting justice is found not in punishment, but in understanding. Father Brown walked on, the frost crunching beneath his boots, the night clear above him, carrying nothing but the weight of quiet things, and the certainty that they were, in the end, sufficient.